Us. Oops, I gotta adjust this a little bit, for joining us this morning in the Climate Mobility Pavilion. We're extremely pleased to have this session with our African champions to showcase some of the work we have done over the last years, we are about to embark on together, and to discuss really how climate mobility can become part of the African adaptation journey, our partner countries' adaptation journey, their adaptation plans. What does that mean in practice? What are we actually looking at in terms of the action that needs to happen, the policies that need to be adopted? I would like to take us a step back to the beginning of this journey, which started really in 2021 with the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, a continental effort between the GCCM, the African Union Commission, the UNDP, World Bank, IOM, and the UNFCCC. The idea was really to develop a common understanding on this issue of climate mobility coming from the development side, the climate side, the migration side. And we had a whole process of consultations. And I wanted to take us back to some of the continental findings to then see how have they broken down in the countries that we've worked with now, and what are some of the recommendations coming forward from that work. So I would like to ask my colleagues to please start my presentation. Oh, I can do it myself. Okay. Let's see. Here we go. Oh, here we go. So the ACMI took a 4-step approach, starting with building knowledge. We did modeling projections of how will climate change, how will the impacts of more extreme weather on crop, on rangelands, on flooding, on sea level rise, how will that affect the movement of people across the continent by 2050? We did primary data collection, doing surveys and interviews with communities across the continent. And we had consultations with stakeholders from across the region and the continent, brought that together in a report, and developed a common agenda for action. We also made a dedicated effort to bring together the youth as a champion group in the continent, with a very active African Youth Forum, an active fellowship program for youth, and products that our youth have developed, including a guide on climate mobility literacy, including training programs, including local projects. And now today we're going to speak about the 4th pillar of this approach, which is the country deep dive. So how do we move from this continental knowledge down to country level insights and recommendations for action? This was the African Shifts report. We launched it at COP27. And the countries that are with us today step forward to be champions of climate mobility at the Sharm el-Sheikh COP. I remember the leaders being in our Climate Mobility Pavilion to embark on this journey together. The research for this effort was undertaken in these 7 places across the continent to get a sense of both what's happening in urban context, what's happening in rural context, different types of sectors of the economy, and also different types of climate risk exposure, from sea level rise to drought, to frequent flooding, to severe storms, as in the case of Beira. And just a very quick snapshot. One of the key findings from that work was that a majority of people have no desire to move. So the desire for people to stay in their communities, stay on their land, is strong. There's also a good chunk of people that said, I would move, but I don't have the resources or the capacities I would need to. And then a smaller share of people that said, we're considering moving. And that smaller share of people that would consider moving, or is even planning to move, those are disproportionately the young people. So among all the age groups, the young were the ones who had most frequently direct or more concrete plans to move. But even among the young people, you see that almost half said, I'm not considering moving. Our modeling projections looked at different future scenarios. And for the purpose of the discussion, we mostly focused on the high emission scenarios, so the RCP6, looking at current trajectories. We're not likely to stay within the RCP 2.6, 1.5 degree temperature rise. What do these projections tell us? They suggest that there will be increased movement on the continent, period, but climate will add to those movements. So people will be moving for all kinds of reasons. An additional share of people will move due to climate reasons, and that could reach up to 130 million according to the model. It could be lower, and this depends very much on the development trajectory. So, the climate factor is the same here. The outcome is different simply because of more inclusive or more unequal development pathways taken. And most of this movement is within countries, not across borders. Here are some of the hotspots areas, so places, where movement will be most concentrated. And you can see the Sahel belt clearly coming out. You see the Great Lakes region. You see coastal areas along the Mediterranean, but also along the West African coast. So some of the continental findings, you often see the border areas being places of higher mobility too. Cross-border mobility is relatively low. Again, this is due to climate reasons, not for other reasons that people may be moving. But just due to climate reasons, we only project around 1 million additional people moving across borders. And that cross-border movement is actually heavily concentrated in Southern Africa. So the SADC region is projected to see the most cross-border movement. And mostly this is actually driven by projected increased crop yields. So as people have more resources at their disposal, they're more able to move longer distances. And this was the continental agenda for action. Very much around, well, first of all, we need to start looking at this phenomenon and try to anticipate and plan for the movement of people. How can it be integrated into country strategies, into the financing strategies? How can people be enabled and empowered to know the risks they're facing so they can make better decisions for their families? How can women in particular be part of finding adaptation solutions? Because we found a significant gap in climate risk awareness between men and women. How can the ambitions that young people have to be mobile and to go for opportunity, how can that be harnessed by creating opportunities for them as part of the climate transition? Starting from local solutions, so recognizing that the adaptation challenges are specific to different locations, not one size will fit all. So the adaptation journey will have to be location specific and take into account the local realities. Cities will be important hubs. People are moving towards not only the big cities, but actually a lot of towns also that are projected to grow significantly. And lastly, how can the development ambitions be realized in a way that doesn't compromise ecosystems, biodiversity, the nature that actually sustains a lot of the livelihoods that people depend upon? So this last part of our work now has been at the country level, and I want to run quickly through the work we have done with our partner countries over the last 2 years. So the objective of these deep dives was to bring down this continental level projections and findings to the local level to understand what does this mean for Uganda, what does this mean for Botswana, what does this mean for Liberia, and how can we inform policies at the national and local levels. The deep dives go through 3 steps: data and research, engagement with stakeholders, and then developing a blueprint for action. I believe this is in Arua. Climate mobility in Uganda. Uganda is part of the IGAD region. The IGAD region will be, according to our projections, the one that will see the most movement due to climate impacts. Up to 10% of the population in the region could be moving due to climate impacts. In Uganda, it's significantly less than 10%, but still there could be a significant increase in people on the move due to climate impacts. Up to 5 million or lower, around 3 million, depending again on development trajectory. These are the hot spots, and you see a lot of movement into more forested areas, more highland areas, and some of the big cities seeing additional growth, like Kampala, for example. In Somalia, unfortunately, we don't have the colleague with us. She was supposed to join us today. Up to a third of the population could be on the move due to climate impacts. So this is the highest rate on the continent. And obviously, climate displacement is already a large reality in the country. Again, we see projections of movement mostly into higher lying areas and out of flood-prone areas. And interestingly, for the next two countries, the dynamic flips. So Uganda and Somalia both go with the continental trend in that you have a more negative development scenario, you have less movement. For Botswana and Liberia, the trend is actually the opposite. You have a better development outcome, you have more people being able to move. So the trend is reversed. So in Botswana, you'll see that actually with a high road scenario where development is more inclusive, you have more people on the move. And that movement is very much concentrated around some of the urban centers and the more urbanized part of the country. For Liberia, again, we have this dynamic of movement being actually slightly higher in a more inclusive development scenario. So if people have more resources in their pockets, so to speak, they are better able to move actually than if they have less resources. And the movement is very much away from the coastline for the most part and into higher lying areas. But cities like Monrovia, again, still continue to see inward mobility. I think the blueprints for action, I'll have our partners talk about those, so I don't want to go into detail. But this is basically bringing down the continental agenda to the national and local level. So through engagement with stakeholders in each country, developing what are some of the key priorities that at the national level need to be addressed to deal with the issue of climate mobility, whether it's already happening or prospectively preventing negative outcomes from going forward. And I think generally those blueprints are structured around enabling people to stay with their rights and dignity, making sure those who move can do so with rights and dignity, and supporting communities that are projected to see people coming in so that inward movement can be well accommodated and services and jobs are in place to deal with that influx. Today's session is really to talk about, well, going through this exercise, how can the knowledge and the recommendations for action generated, how can those inform adaptation strategies at the national level? How can we identify the local communities that most need support in the country? And how can this dovetail with financing strategies? So how can countries actually access finance to support some of the priorities that are identified through the process? And I'm very pleased to have a distinguished panel of partners join me for this discussion. And I would like to invite them to the panel now. I'll first invite up Dr. Juraj Jakpavolo, the Executive Director of the Environmental Protection Agency of Liberia. I'll invite up Mr. Maikutlo Mokakapadi, Senior Meteorologist at the Ministry of Environment and Tourism of Botswana. Mr. Bob Natifu, Commissioner for Climate Change in the Ministry of Environment and Water and Environment of Uganda, and Mr. Alhamdu Dorsuna, Director of Climate Change and Green Growth at the African Development Bank. Thank you for joining me. I will come and sit with you. Unfortunately, we have one mic, so we're going to have to pass this down the aisle. I would like to start with an opening question to our colleagues from partner countries. And this is mainly about the face of climate mobility in your country. We often say migration, displacement is the face of the climate crisis. It's where we see the real human impact. But if you think about your country context, who are the people, which are the areas that you think about or that come to the fore when we talk about climate mobility?
Does this work? All right, so thanks very much, Sarah, for the very good introduction. And I'm happy to be here for so many reasons, because I think I've worked with GCCM and Prof when we're trying to find a common agenda in Kampala around this topic of human mobility. But back to your question, what's the face of human mobility like in our countries vis-a-vis the extreme challenges that we're faced with? So I have read a book which maybe I'll recommend to most of your youth who are into this. Professor Goldin, Ian's book, which talks about, which is about the shortest history of migration. And I think some of you might have landed on it. So the shortest history of migration starts with a simple core message and says, we are all migrants. And he kind of reframes that around issues to do with we are all migrants, but he also acknowledges that if there was no migration, then there wouldn't be human civilization. So in that sense, we agree, maybe it's a positive thing, right? But to understand that better, we need to put into context the policy and science context. And I think you've made a bit of references in your presentation. So if you look at the science and policy context, if you go way back to the IPCC assessment report, which said that we would overshoot between now and 2035, which is currently happening now as you've reflected, but also going deeper further to reflect that the investments that are needed to address adaptation will actually more than triple based on what is on the ground. Now, if you cascade that further into what is happening in country in terms of movements, it puts a very huge dilemma on countries and how they must respond. So we see people moving, not just within the districts that they are destined to, but also across borders. And that's likely to happen. It's gonna be more exacerbated by the urgent and more complex interactions of climate that we are faced with. So we kind of see this increasing conglomeration of people within certain cities and places, which may not be effectively planned to actually benefit from the settlements within the cities where they are, which also puts a cost on the face of government to implement that, which calls for kind of formulating very meaningful strategies and policies on how to address that. Is that something that we could control? Perhaps yes. Could be controlled depending on what kind of actions that we do in our different localities, but that means that it has to be something even beyond boundaries to transboundary, because something that happens in DRC or something that happens in Kenya has a likelihood of what is going to happen in Uganda. A simple example is we are purely farmers. Farmers heavily rely on rain-fed agriculture. So in the absence of rain, if it's too much rain or too little rain, there's not going to be any harvest at all. And people are constantly on the move because their livelihoods are shattered. So that's why from our point of view, I think human mobility is increasingly becoming important, but also being made worse with the climate impacts that we are faced with, that has made people lose their livelihood, that has made people lose their dignity, that has made people lose their identity. Thank you.
Good day. Uh, Thank you, Sarah, for the opportunity that you have given us today. So, to start off, from Botswana's point of view, I think based on what transpired during our consultation through this exercise to assess the climate mobility part of the impacts of climate change, because the impacts are mainly dominant in sectors that rely on agriculture, for example, the water sector, and the mining sector also. Uh, Looking at the agriculture sector, uh, we notice that people tend to migrate uh, from place to place in search of greener pastures that is driven by drought mostly. And for some instance, the movement can be associated with people looking for better opportunities that are better offered in urban areas. So we really try to incorporate all aspects driven by mobility in general, and analyze the climate mobility aspect of it using the data that was acquired through the climate modeling exercise, which identified different hotspots in different areas in the country. But the most interesting observation that we noticed in the country is that the issue of climate mobility was never integrated in all climate change policy frameworks. It was never integrated on all the national development plans. And during our consultative workshop that we carried in a mining area, we really struggle a lot to try to bridge the gap between separation between movement that is induced by climate and movement that is attributed to the social and economic factors. So I think that aspect on the knowledge gap between the policymakers and the community really played part in understanding the climate mobility observation in Botswana. But generally, I can just summarize that from the whole climate mobility initiative, we really gain some ground in the future. We can integrate climate mobility because migration was happening in the past, people moving from one place to another in search of greener pastures, driven by the droughts, but not necessarily the extreme events like the floods and everything, because in one area we have an area that is prone to floods, but people are not willing to move. In some cases, they have forced the government, which is the local land allocating body, to allocate them land in flood-prone area. But at the same time, they are pushing for initiative to be done, driven by the fact that they are affected by the floods, which is impacts that they deal with on seasonal basis. So in all, I can say that the aspect of mobility has been identified, and we plan to use that information in the future to be integrated in our national development plans or any other policy that can come forth after this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Climate Mobility, we've been together for some time now, and we'll continue to work together. Climate mobility, movement of people, mobility move, climate causing people to move. We have always moved. I think all of us know that fight, that people have always moved, either by push or pull factors. I think this one is special because the movement is abrupt. So much so before you make your mind, you have to move. That's the difficulties we are faced with. For instance, on September 3rd, we are building a coastal defense in one of our cities called Greenville. May 13, I stood to a point with officials from the UNDP to break the ground on a coconut tree. That's May 13th of this year. By September 3rd, when I reached there, the coconut tree was gone. Literally. The area that we stood to cut the ribbon for the construction of the revetment, May 13, by September 3rd, I could not stand there anymore. I mean, think about that. And you stretch that along the entire coast where there are buildings, where there are people. I mean, it's amazing to see what is happening. So that is part of the in-country movement we're talking about. The forceful movement of people. As executive director for the EPA, I get letters almost every week from property owners. Liberia has a long coastline, 350 miles. 9 of our counties are on the Atlantic Ocean. The climate is changing, is causing people to move by force. And it's really bad what we are experiencing. That's just about the coastal areas. But even in the city of Monrovia and other areas where people move and they settle along the wetland, and it's dry. Then before you look, heavy rain. Within 24 hours, everywhere is flooded. And then they have to move. They can't stay within the floor area. So it's serious. Cross-country border, we are facing huge number of people coming from the Sahel, Burkina Faso areas. They are coming down. When I ask their minister what is happening, the drought in our area and the death of animals in our area, pastoralists cannot feed their animals because no pastures. And they have to move downward. And because of the porousness of our border, they come through. So this is something that we are dealing with. I think the way to tackle this is one of the methodology the Global Center is doing for us to come with a roadmap. So right now, working with the Global Center for us to develop a climate mobility plan for Liberia. It is important because this has to be tied into the overall disaster management system of the country. Because this is a disaster, literally moving people. So we've got to tie that framework so that we have that roadmap and we have a strategy as to how to deal with this. Thankfully, in Liberia, we do have some good culture, especially among our indigenous local people. Historically, when I moved to a town, he is my stranger father, and I stay with him, and over time, I integrate into the community. Normally, you stay with a stranger father, and the stranger father will introduce you into that community. The thing about it is those type of positive cultural attitude, we got to promote it because people are moving into different communities. They have to find stranger fathers. They have to stay with them. It is overwhelming because historically, it will take time. It will not be a group of people show up in the community almost simultaneously. It becomes overwhelming for the local people and the resources are there. However, the solution, again, have a roadmap, but we need to elevate our voices in the way that when we're discussing adaptation, even loss and damage, they should integrate is part of that. Disaster management, the loss and damage fund, adaptation, everything is coming together. Mobility is a bigger part. Areas people are moving, but those who are staying back, what can we do for them to stay back? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introductory round of just giving us impressions of the realities in the different countries. And I think you've all highlighted the link between, the climate impacts on rural livelihoods or livelihoods that depend on rangeland, croplands, animal husbandry, and making sure that the resources that sustain those livelihoods are being protected. And then what you highlighted, the situation of sea level rise and coastal erosion, and really, the suddenness with which all of a sudden something that's gradual can then have a very dramatic impact. I think we also hear, even from countries that are traditionally more experiencing drought and water scarcity, about these crazy rains that then, in a very short period of time, just brings so much water down that, again, like infrastructure that was never designed to cope with that is like completely overwhelmed. So those are some of the hazards. I think in terms of the people that are affected, I would love for you to speak to that a little bit also in the next round. Like, who are the people that you see most affected? I think oftentimes it's communities that are already on the margins, so to speak, and so reaching them is not necessarily always easy. But it's also very affluent centers of economic growth and that power national economies. And so there's also a real challenge of how to protect those economic engines. Before I go back to our partners, I would love to invite Dr. Drosuma to give us a perspective from the African Development Bank, how this issue has come up in your work. Has it come up? And what kinds of projects or policy initiatives have you supported to deal with this?
Oh, thank you very much. Let me first thank you for the overview you provided. It is useful, especially the deep dives, the case studies, country case studies. I'm saying that because last year at COP29, we had a similar panel discussion in your mobility pavilion. And after that, I went back and I started working on a research paper. I started doing a policy brief for my management to inform them on how important is climate mobility in our climate agenda. And I decided to expand it to a research paper, which is almost done. And I'm going to reference some of your work you presented today. And this is to tell you that this issue is really emerging in our development finance as an important element. I'm sure you already know that diaspora finance has become the most important element of development financing across developing countries in general, but particularly in the African continent. For the bank, you may be aware that we have been prioritizing adaptation financing for more than 10 years now in our climate agenda, because you also know that adaptation is Africa's priority on climate change. And when we started our adaptation journey, we realized that our investments go more into mitigation than adaptation. And we decided to strike the balance between adaptation and mitigation. And as I speak today, we are spending more than 60% of our climate financing resources to adaptation than mitigation. For us, it's a shift because it's a very useful shift, because we need to align with the priorities of the African continent on climate change. Now, coming back to your issue around climate mobility, we have some tools in the bank that we are leveraging to address the challenge. It's not, and this is where the paper that I'm working on is coming in play, because I am making the argument that climate mobility is an important adaptation strategy. It has been the case in several centuries already in Africa, because people have been moving in a way that movement of people is seen as a way of diversifying livelihoods, but also sharing the risk. People move, those who move are able to support communities that stay to build their resilience. So it's not a new thing, but we need to scale up this approach. And even when people go, when they cross the borders, go to different places, they send back money that helps their communities to build their resilience. So we need to see climate migrants, for instance, as agents of change, as people that are also contributing to building resilience of their communities. This argument is very important. So both at ex ante level, meaning prevention, as you mentioned in your call for action, but also ex post, because when these climate disasters happen, people need assistance, and assistance come from, especially the first entry point is their people sitting abroad, their people abroad helping them to withstand the negative impacts of climate change. So I think having that as a perspective is very critical. Migration, climate migration as an adaptation strategy. Number two, at the bank, what the tools that we have, for instance, we have a financing tool called Transitional Support Facility. It is our main financing tool to support, countries in transition. We no longer call them fragile states because it's not the good way of portraying those countries. So countries in transition are being supported through those tools. There are two elements of that. One is on prevention, and there is another envelope on response. And then we have another one which is targeting climate mainstreaming overall. So TSF, the Transitional Support Facility, is able to provide funding, especially to address the root causes of migration. Because you know that the root causes of climate migration are actually not climate related. They are mostly non-climatic drivers: poverty, famine, lack of education, etc. So how do you fix that issue first before coming to climate issues? So for instance, I am going to just give you one or two examples. One is a program we are implementing in the Horn of Africa on food security, how you ensure that you provide sufficient food to people so that they have to stay in their communities and continue to grow food. Number two, how do you provide them during drought, for instance? How do you provide them with resistant seeds for them to build resilience and also get access to food in the meantime? The same program is being replicated in West Africa, where we are able to provide the same approach, having food security as at the heart of the program, so that people, farmers especially, are able to stay in their communities, build their own resilience without necessarily having to move. Of course, people have to move, be it because of climate or not, people will continue to move. But at least you are able to address the vulnerabilities from the root causes of those vulnerabilities: poverty, famine, etc. Finally, I think one important area of focus should be on how we ensure that, building on recent experiences in Ethiopia, for instance, diaspora has played a role in building the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. Kenya has been able to issue a bond, a green bond, that has been useful for investing in infrastructure projects. Nigeria has done the same. We need to build on such experiences to introduce a new asset class of diaspora bonds that will be able to provide additional resources for financing adaptation in Africa. Because as you know, adaptation in Africa is largely underfunded, and the current financing landscape is not helping. We need to be innovative. And I believe diaspora financing is going to play an important role in that adaptation financing landscape in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And it's wonderful to hear that we inspired some follow-up from last year's COP. That is really encouraging. And thank you also for sharing some concrete examples of how countries have leveraged their diaspora to advance their climate-related or just infrastructure-related projects. I think there's often a tension between kind of protecting the right to stay and also defending people's right to move, if you will. And I think it's really not an either or. So one thing that I think really needs to be very strongly emphasized when we talk about climate mobility is that we really need both, right? Like we need to enable people who want to stay in place to do that as much as possible. Obviously, if your house falls off a cliff into the ocean, then maybe there's not much to be done. But basically, we need to make sure that people can stay where they really want to stay, and at the same time also make it possible to move with dignity. And I think Africa already actually has a lot of enabling policy frameworks. The question comes down to implementation and putting political will behind them. I want to ask one last round of questions and then open it up to the audience. And that is really now around the next step. We're working with all of you to look at how can we integrate the findings from the blueprint into national policies and planning, whether it's NAPS, whether it's the NDC, whether it's the next national development plan, to make sure this gets anchored. And so I would, on the one hand, really welcome your reflection on what's the benefits of integrating this agenda into national plans and policies. But then also, second part of the question, I think we know that, again, like there's a lot of plans and policies that are beautiful, but not always, leading to impact on the ground. And so I would also like you to reflect on, A, why it's important to put climate mobility, and B, what are some of the key bottlenecks that need to be addressed so that it doesn't just stay in a plan or strategy, but actually has some impact.
Okay, so thanks again. I'll speak about three issues. The first one is let's look at the numbers right from global level. If you look at the numbers of people that are supposed to move due to either climate impacts or whatever, the projections that we have is about between 1 billion to 3 billion, right? When you come to Uganda specifically, the African Center for Migration, ACME, has kind of come up with a postulation of how many people are bound to move, between 2.8 to 5.1 million. Now that's a huge number of people considering the context within which we survive as Uganda. And when you look at, again, the IPCC synthesis report, it talks about adaptation being unevenly distributed. So the migration of these people, or the movement of people, actually undermines the adaptation effort that we're supposed to have on ground. The clearest example is if you look at our NDCs or NAPs, if you look at NDCs, for example, we put forward nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions bound around conserving forests, conserving wetlands, and so on and so forth. The question then becomes, when these people are moving, and these are the same people on the margins that you talked about, what are their sources of livelihood? They are going to achieve their sources of livelihood from what these targets that we've set, from what we've set ourselves to achieve as targets to meet our climate goals. So for example, we are saying we want to increase forestry cover from 10% to 28%, just as an example. And when you have an amount of people on the margins or refugees being part of the development process, it is 5 steps backwards, because then their source of firewood, for example, is going to be what you're looking out for to conserve to meet your climate goals. So that's why it's critically important. How do we begin reflecting this, not only in the NDCs, but also in the national adaptation plans of action? But then there's another layer to that. Reflecting them in our national strategies is not sufficient enough. What's sufficient is that how then do we mobilize the means to actually implement actions that will improve the individual livelihood and well-being of these people who are at the margins? Because we all call ourselves adaptation-first countries. And what that means is that how do we improve individual livelihood and well-being? By providing the necessary services that people need so that they do not interact with the climate goals that we've set ourselves to achieve. The connection to that is making sure there is means available in terms of financing, for example, or whichever way you look at it. So how do we begin thinking very broadly In one, we've already agreed human mobility is a challenge, and climate change even makes it worse. So how do we make sure that we think about innovative financing initiatives beyond what we have in country, but also things like the multilateral entities that we are dealing with at the UNFCCC level? If you go to Green Climate Fund and you have a proposal purely on addressing human mobility issues, I don't think you'll be able to get any financing, because one of the most difficult things that you have to deal with is to justify the climate rationale. So I think as parties here, what we need to do is kind of send a signal to GCF. What kind of guidance do we give to GCF in due recognition that countries have accepted or not that human mobility or migration is a problem? So how then could we create windows within the existing multilateral entities so that countries can access support to implement the action to save tomorrow's climate today? Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to just start off by saying that Botswana has done a lot of policies and frameworks and plan, you name them. So we have the overarching climate change policy going together with the strategy and action plan. We have we don't yet have our national adaptation plan, but we are on the verge of developing one. And we have revised our NDC, our national determined contribution. All these documents are example of the framework that we as a country have. So you'll realize that for the case of Botswana, most people are confined to the city. So, but not meaning all the resources needed by the people are already there. For example, looking at the water sector, the water management, the northern part of Botswana is mostly confined with more rain than the southern. And the city is placed in the southern part of Botswana. So what we did to address the shortage of water in the south, we moved water to the south. This was done through a program called the North-South Career, and we keep on revising that program to integrate the shortage of water in that area. So that's one example of mobility being used to address a shortage of water that is driven by less precipitation on the southern part. And there is another component which usually we overlook it when we come up with our development plans, which is to take services to the rural communities. So you will realize most of the people that choose to migrate to the urban areas, they are only chasing for the resources that are already available at urban areas. So in that sense, for example, some of the climate actions that can arise from the mobility part of it is looking at the composition or the density of the group that is moving a lot. We are looking at the youth. So the youth is mostly moving from the rural to urban areas, looking for educational opportunities, looking for other initiatives that can elevate either their livelihood or the environment that they are in, looking at the agriculture sector. So such ideas are driven by the means, the financial means to ensure that we integrate that kind of resource to ensure that we limit that kind of movement, which is likely to be kept. Then looking at the already exercise of developing our blueprint, we hosted our last validation workshop a few weeks back, but upon finalizing that blueprint, there were issues around implementation. We have done a lot in terms of policy, a lot in terms of planning. The documents keep on piling with no implementation. And the issue is around financial means. That's why at the end of the meeting we assessed, and they came up with a plan, a solid plan, that we need to have a task force that is centered on enabling or creating an environment where finance can be accessed to implement all the activities that have been proposed in our climate mobility blueprint, rather than wait for another cycle of developing our national plans and try to integrate that into our government or public budget. Let us have another source whereby we can lobby support from the international community and try to, or at least try to prioritize the measures that are already picked in our blueprint and try to implement them at community level. Because at rural level or the community, they are only concerned about implementation. It's only us at government level where we are concerned about making policies, ensuring that we develop reports, and ensuring that we meet submission deadline within the convention and the Paris Agreement. But all those are not of a concern to them. They want tangible things that they can see and can educate their young ones that we are moving in this kind of approach, looking at the sustainable environmental pathways. So let us keep that in mind, that implementation here is key. We can lobby support to come up with plans, but at the end, it is those actions that matters at the end of the day. So, thank you.
I think because of time, I'll be short. Just say two things. One, communication. We really need to amplify the whole climate change communication. Water mobility, different type of import. The more we educate, the more those who are moving, they have the information to move. And those who are receiving them might be much more receptive of them or much more empathetic of the other people that are coming to them. Those who want to stay, information will help them as to how to cope if they are staying. So I think we need to invest a lot into communication. The second one has to do with those who are responsible for the warming. If climate mobility is directly proportional to the warming of the earth, it makes sense to keep the temperature down. That's a bigger picture though. Again, so major polluters, major emitters, they really need to slow down. They need to take steps to slow down. They also need to take steps to finalize some of the gaps that we have identified in country and other places. I think it's very, very important. I just wanted to highlight the 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you, and I have to renege on my promise to open for question and answers because we are at time. I'm very sorry. I wanted to make one point and a little plug, speaking to the comment by a colleague from Botswana about the political pressure to deliver and the long timelines of climate finance that often don't really align with the need for meeting constituents' expectations. And so one concrete step that we have taken to help our partner countries hopefully close some of those expectations gap is setting up a small grants facility, the Community's Climate Adaptation Facility. It was presented here yesterday. We have so far rolled it out in the Pacific and Caribbean, and we're really actively working to fundraise for Africa because we do want to bring the facility to Africa. And what it does is really deliver quick impact grants directly to local communities. And the commitment is to get the decisions in 90 days. So really to move quickly and fast and non-bureaucratically. Thank you all. This was great. I'm sorry it is so hot here. But I really appreciate all you coming, sharing your experience and working with us. And I look forward to the continued cooperation. And I wish you a great COP. Thank you.